Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast, where we ignite the sparks of change and inspire a world free of racism. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting the most cutting-edge anti-racist research and education for the purpose of connecting practitioners to powerful research-based approaches to racial equity. I am your host, Dr. Tracey A. Benson, and today we invite you on a transformative journey as we delve into the efforts and triumphs of those dedicated to fostering racial equity within education. Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research and Practice podcast. Today, we have the opportunity to talk with esteemed scholar Dr. Asia Reynolds about her research on Black girlhood identities and geographies in the neoliberal carceral state to explore liberatory practice. Dr. Reynolds is an assistant professor of urban education and critical race studies in the teacher education department at Wayne State University. Welcome to the program.
Hi.
Awesome. I really appreciate you joining me today. And again, today's just a casual conversation around your research and what you hope for the field because of your research. So could you start out just by, introducing yourself, tell us a little bit about your education journey and why you study what you study?
Yeah, great. So, I always been pretty good at school. And when I think about what that even means, that means very good at playing the role of good Black girl, so that I always had access to certain opportunities in school. And so I went and got my undergrad at Penn State University, and I actually studied criminal justice. I had a minor in social and African American studies, but I studied criminal justice. And I really thought that I was going to work in a juvenile justice in some way with young people. That was my idea of working with young people who were in the juvenile justice system. My first job outside of when I graduated from undergrad happened to be a college counselor, college advising counselor. And I was at my alma mater, the high school I actually went to. And that changed the trajectory of everything. Like, I think I always was supposed to be a teacher, but I always hear, normal young people, I always hear teachers don't make money. So I was like, I'm not going to be a teacher. But I think I wanted to work with young people. And young people who people usually deem are troubled or at risk or whatever the term is now. And so I had my first job as a college advisor, and I love what I did working with kids. I love being in the school space. And I also think just through that, even though I didn't have the professional development around how to work with young people since I came through a criminal justice program, but I also knew as I was working with those young people that school was a place of so much possibility, but also so much harm. And I wanted to study somewhere where I felt like they saw young people as people, and that also were thinking about liberatory education. So I applied to the master's program. I got in. I actually deferred it for a year because I also didn't know anything really about master's programs. So I had no real plan around how do I pay for this? I was just cool, I'm gonna apply to school and see what happens. And so then I was like, okay, let me seriously think about how I'm going to pay for this. And that I'm going to make this big leap to Chicago because I didn't know anyone in Chicago. And when I got to Chicago, I just feel really blessed that not only were the people in my program so amazing and thinking about in their radical thinking around youth culture, working with youth, liberatory spaces for education, social, all of this was happening within our program. And it was because the curriculum was cool, but it was the dynamic people that I just think was in the program at the time. This program was attracting a certain type of people who were just serious about how do we create this other world for young people. And serious about many of us probably were also seen in different parts of our lives as troublemakers or knowing that school just never sat completely right with us. And so I think that was just amazing. I was in Chicago when the teacher strike happened. That was also very much part of my political development of just being there and being part of the teacher strike and working with certain organizations on the ground of trying to figure out how we're making the connections about other things that we were seeing happening in the city, what other organizations we should be doing coalition building with, and just broadening my ideals around what is education in the first place and what is its purpose. And then I was like, if I pursue this PhD, like, what is the impact? What is the thing that I want to be able to do other than just say I'm a doctor, right? Especially when I spent all these years and money. So, I mean, I think for me, from that angle, I was just like, one, I think the program that I went into was just Social Foundations, which is a dying program across the country, right? Because a lot of times people have seen Social Foundations as a very radical space. And I just was just, at the right place at the right time between people that were in my program and people across the campus who were having these conversations about abolition and how do we look at freedom schools as models of schooling and where are all these other places that we can be engaged in radical political education. And so I wanted to continue to just develop there around those type of scholars who also were very much activists and in their community and think about how do I have this broader impact on the education system at large, whether it's administrators, whether it's teachers, whether it's just working with families, like what does that look like? And so that's how I started into my PhD program. My original project was like supposed to look at like Chirac and how terminology like that is used to legitimize violence against Black and Brown communities and how they engage in hip hop. That was my original project. I realized that we were having such conversations at the time around community violence in Chicago. And we were having those conversations around Black girls and not with Black girls and asking them about what their experience navigating that space. The ways that we were looking at violence was also just limited and not capturing their full experience. And so that's kind of what led me to this place of like, I want to hear and be with Black girls to learn more about their schooling experience and their experience navigating this terrain of violence and what is how do we expand our notions around what is violence. So I was working with an organization, A Long Walk Home, which I still do work with it and collaborate with, who particularly work with Black girls between the ages of 14 and 18 doing arts, activism, and healing. And they are usually to end gender violence. And many of them may be survivors or friends of or family of someone who might be a sexual survivor. And so like that has been the starting place for the work. But I think the work is much broader than that, of really thinking about freedom, resistance, or refusal, not only for Black girls, I think, but just for our even our community.
Wow, that sounds like a very interesting journey where you sort of found your place, coming from your background and working in schools and then finding your place with Black girls. I think it's an area, of course, it's understudied, of course, as it typically is around people of color. So you said three things I want to sort of explore in a way. And the first thing, you started in the beginning of your story was about being the good Black girl, right? Because this is a concept I think is very important, right? And it sort of aligns to my story as I knew what it was to be the good Black kid from Milwaukee. I was a part of an integration program where I was bused from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, out to a place called Brown Deer. And, you had the good Black kids and then the other Black kids, right? We acted the same, but I knew how to stay out of the fray because if I stepped over the line, I was a bad Black kid, right? So I want to explore that concept with you because it's very important because you said also that schools could be places of great promise, but also of great harm. And I think it connects to that concept, especially with brown skin. And then I want to sort of explore what liberatory praxis means, right? Because, that term comes out, but what does that mean? Abolitionist, what does that mean? You mean abolish schools? And so let's start with the concept of, your experience as a student. And you said very specifically, you knew how to be the good Black girl. What does that mean?
I think there's just certain messaging that you get when you're young, whether it's from family, schools, church, if you're or religious institutions or wherever else you're navigating, that you might not be able to cognitively articulate I know that that y'all like certain kids and you like them this way and they get rewarded and these kids don't get rewarded. But it's like there's just certain messaging that you understand, right? That if you're savvy enough, like you understand, like, oh, if I come into the classroom and do these things, particularly as a Black kid, I get rewarded. But if I do these things, I get over here. And I think it becomes most apparent to me. It became most apparent to me when they start tracking, right? Like the further you keep going up in grades and then you start getting tracked, right? Because the same people that you used to have class with, you no longer have class with. And if you had class with those other students, you know that like either you're no smarter than them or you're just as smart as them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not actually really sure like why you are being put over here now and they aren't coming with you. Right? It like doesn't make sense to you. Um and then when you get put over here in this other group, you get special privileges, right? Like you start to see like, oh, we're going on field trips regularly. Oh, we get invited to, if the mayor or the president comes to in town, right? I'm one of the kids, the cream of the crop kids that will get invited to go and be at this special event. Or if someone comes to the school, I'm in the group that they meet with, right? And so you just start to get this messaging that like, if I come in here and behave, right? And also like I was a big black girl, right? So I also understood how easily I can be read as dangerous or aggressive. And I understood that at a young age, right? And so I think I definitely use humor as a shield of navigating those spaces where I can make students and teachers laugh, right? And so I
Mm-hmm.
understood those things as my shield of like, this is my asset. And this asset allows me to maneuver in a particular way that I'm not read as aggressive. And I'm just playful enough that I'm not just like it's not a minstrel show, right? Like I'm playful enough that it's like they don't think that playfulness means that I'm also not intelligent, right? And so it
Mm-hmm.
was like I feel like I had to really find my niche or like the thing that worked for me to be able to continue to get access to these spaces, right? And
Yeah,
then
and I have a
having to
couple.
understand that like when you get access to these spaces, that it's supposed to be the way that you will have access to better things in life, right? Like a better quality of life. So
Yeah, and how early on would you say that you, I mean, consciously learned this, right? Because become aware. I don't know the
yeah,
demographics of the schools that you went to, right? I know my
yeah,
school was pretty, I mean, it was like 5% black, right? And I was one of the very
yeah.
few black kids at school. So I felt black as soon as I walked in. I mean, I went from a black neighborhood, shipped out to the, whitest suburb, right? So I become very aware of my blackness in the third grade. That's when I was transferred to this white school. And so when did you learn this concept of how to see yourself as a black girl and how you sort of absorb the culture of what it's like to be non-confrontational or not seen as aggressive? Like, how young were you when you realized that this was strategy you needed to use?
I'm not really sure. I mean, most schooling spaces that I was in were pretty black and white, right? There might have been some Asian or Latinx kids like in between, but they were such a small number, right? And one of the schools that I grew up mostly in, which was a public school, I mean it almost like literally it's almost like 50-50. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think in those moments, right, especially because then I go home and I live in a full black community. So it's very apparent when I go into these school spaces, right? Like that there's something that clicks of like I'm black. So I don't know what age I maybe was like most conscious around. I want to say probably in middle school. And like I said, because that is when we really got tracked. Like for us
Mm-hmm.
like as we was going through elementary school for the most part, we were all in the same classes. Unless you were in that smaller group that might have been gifted kids.
Mm-hmm.
Um and the gifted kids were always mostly white. And I don't know that I questioned anything about the gifted program. I didn't even really know what they did. So I think I didn't even care to like try to be like, why they get to go to gifted, whatever. But definitely I want to say by middle school because of how we start to get tracked and me not understanding like why my friends are not in my class.
Yeah, and so this concept, and I want to explore this again. We said, schools could be a place of great promise, but also great harm. And someone could listen to this and say, "Oh, well, Dr. Reynolds, we'll just bring her in and have her talk to the black kids about how to be the good black boy or black girl as a strategy." Someone could read it that way. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the issue is never the kids. The issue is the actual school structuring itself, right? And really understanding how schools is such a carceral place. We don't talk enough, I think, about how much black and brown children have to give up to be in a school space. Because whether that learning was conscious or unconscious for me, that means I had to learn very early and strip myself of certain things to be read, legible, and be rewarded in their school space. And we don't think enough about what the price and cost of that is, right? Not only emotionally and mentally, but even spiritually, of what we're asking, like what that takes for young black and brown folks who have to come into school spaces where most of their teachers may be young, bright-eyed, and white women, where you're always having to earn everything, right? Like there's always a threat that this all could be taken away. And so, yeah, schools very much become very carceral. Because I think about education broadly, right? There's a distinction that I'm always careful to make between education and schooling. Schooling for
Mm-hmm.
me is what I think about is that school building that we go down to that is very much centered around white supremacist middle class ideals, right? And has always been structured in a way, particularly for Black and brown people, to be an indoctrination into nationalist ideals that are often in conflict of how we see ourselves and our ideas of self-determination, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the beautiful part is that I think Black institutions have also been at the forefront of providing this subversive education that I think allowed many of us to really ground ourselves in our Blackness or see ourselves in ways that schools maybe didn't allow us to see ourselves.
Yeah. So how does that fit in with liberatory practice, right? So praxis. So a previous colleague that I had on the show was talking about abolitionist practices, liberatory praxis, right? And within that, the construct of schooling, there's not much, sort of retrofitting we can do in the traditional space, right?
Yeah.
Traditional schooling space. And
Yeah.
so, in your mind, what is liberatory praxis, and how does that manifest?
Yeah, this is so important because I don't always think I have the answer, but it's always something that I'm trying to work through, right? When me and my colleague wrote the article, You Can't Steal My Joy, much of our conversations in trying to write that article was centered around what are the possibilities of school? Like with us taking in the whole history of how we know that these schools come to be and what their main purpose is, what is the possibilities of school? Because we didn't want to write this surface article about Black joy. We wanted to think about, I think what you were even getting at a little bit earlier of like, how do we think about how kids aren't the problem, but the school itself is the problem? And that oftentimes we're asking young people to learn to cope and assimilate into a space that is harmful to them,
Mm.
right? And how do we think about Black joy that is not about respectability politics, right? And so as we continue to like have those conversations and go back and forth, the tension was around, can the traditional schooling space do that? And I think we keep coming back to no, right? So the moments of Black joy that happens in school spaces is in spite of what the school is, right? Like the
Mm.
things that we love, I think, about school is in spite of what the school is actually supposed to do. And so I think when that's that's the issue, right? It's like the things that we actually do love about school or the things that even like Black communities value about educational space, because we have always understand this, particularly in the US, educational spaces as a practice of freedom, as a way of getting to know ourselves and being in community with one another, right? Of trying to decide how we want to be with one another and self-determination. And so that often is, if that is happening in a school building, that's in spite of what school was supposed to do, right?
Mhm.
We're under this attack where we can't bring that to like that should be the center of what schooling is doing, but that isn't happening, right? And it's not happening for many reasons. It's not happening because we don't have enough Black teachers. It's not happening because the training that teachers get is also racist and problematic. It's not happening because we're watching our federal government continuously put the schools under attack, no matter who has been in leadership, right? Many of the
Mhm.
reforms that have come down have continued to hold Black and brown schools hostage and continue to give them less of the things that they need to function in any way. And so yeah, it's really having to contend with the things that we do love about that we imagine schools doing that is for the good, that we love about school, the parts of school that we think make us feel good is actually in spite of what schools are supposed to do. And so if that's the case, sure, we have to really rethink like both the school itself, but also education and where else can that be happening.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And so a lot of the folks, listeners out there are practitioners, right? That's the purpose of this podcast is to talk with teachers, talk with leaders. And part of what we do in the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute in our partnerships is that we encourage circle of influence, right? Whether you're a classroom teacher, whether you're a school leader, whether you're a district leader, what is your circle of influence and how can you impact the experience of students of color? right? Because it's easy to get overwhelmed by if you think about the history of schooling and the initial intent around sort of, with the Native American schools around elimination or assimilation, and then, restricting education from, stolen Africans that you can't learn to read, you can't be educated, was so illegal. So it's been a weapon for the greater part of our history as a country, right? Those are the foundations of our education system. And if you get into the totality of it, it's like, where do we go? Like I'm just stuck in neutral with just in the learning space. However, there are scholars like yourself who are out there, doing research around. I like the name of your article. You get to what practices and possibilities for Black joy in urban education. And so, we're thinking about capturing Black joy, whether it's from the educator end or from the student end. What is something that a practitioner can do that's within their circle of influence?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because I do think that is very easy to get in a place where like this is heavy. And if I think I'm interpreting circle of influence right, is that like the people you're building with? Is that like, what do you consider?
So for instance, I started my career as a fourth grade teacher, right? I'm a teacher in a classroom. I have about 20-something kids. I have a team of 4 other teachers. I was a math and science teacher, right? Maybe I had some access to the administration to suggest PD, but that's about it. I'm not running schools. I'm not making policy, right? My circle of influence is directly with kids, with families, and with the team that I'm working on.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. So I thank you for that question. Same, right? So I started off as a college advisor, and I also was teaching a class at the time. And I think what I learned very early from that moment was a few things. One, be in community with folks who have the same goal as you. So I can spend a lot of time just arguing with everybody else who would think whatever I'm doing is too ambitious. And that's how people, like, seriously, people were like, they're doing too much. These kids are going to college. You're too ambitious. Oh, if you have that event, they're just going to go there and cut up the whole time anyway. They're not going to receive what you get, right? That I met, and it caught me so off guard, because I want to remind, I was in my alma mater. So these are also some of the folks who taught me. These are some of the people who was in the front office when I was coming in. These are some of the folks who might have been a principal or assistant principal that might have moved up. So these are the same folks that, like, now I'm also like, so what did you think about us, right? Like, if this is your thought process about these young people. But I was met with so much of that, like, right? And I could have got stuck there, right? Or I could have been very easily just like, well, they're right. That many kids aren't going to go to college, so let me not overextend myself. But what was also helpful is that I found people who were like willing to ride or die and be like, no, this is possible. But what they knew is that they loved these kids and that these kids deserve nice things. And that was enough for us to build together, right? That was enough for when I was like, I'm doing a field trip. We're going to do a college field trip somewhere. And I would have those 2 same people be down to be chaperones, right? Right. So that's one. Never doing this alone, right? Like, we can't do this alone. It's impossible to do alone. It's going to wear you out on this alone. Even just not having the emotional support to do this, right? So definitely finding your people, and your people is in there. There are going to be people in that school that can be your people. And it might not be even another teacher, or it might not be another teacher in your grade. It might be the janitor. Like I said, me and the janitor was tight. I think my job was 2 parts of like creating the impossible in that school space for young people to feel joy and to be a disruptor to folks who continue to try to steal their joy. Right? And so when I am invited to the meeting, that I try to really work through, like, what is my role of not just being a bystander of folks trying to do harm to young people. But yeah, I also, the last one thing I would say too is building with families, because they also just have power. They have power to influence that school. You get enough parents to come up there and say, I want these things to happen. The school has no choice but to do that. So also, like, it was just really important for me to build with families and empower families. People care about their children. I think oftentimes, particularly working in Black and brown spaces, that we are taught this ideal to pathologize Black and brown parents as not caring. They're not going to come to this. They won't come up to the school. So, like, I always tell people, I was like, one of the things is that I was like, I want parents to be able to come to things. What barriers do I have to move out the way for them to be here? That might mean that I have to now do a program later than I want to stay here at the school, because I know that they'll be home by then. That might mean that I have to have childcare because I know that that's going to be an issue of them having to bring all the children with them. I know that I'm going to have to serve food. We're going to have to do real dinner because this is dinner time, right? Like, what are the barriers that I move out of the way for families to be engaged? Like, I don't think people really imagine how excited parents and families get when they're actually being asked to be a part of whatever you're doing, right? Because they don't
Right.
often get asked.
Great. Thank you for sharing those very practical examples from the position that you had when you were working in schools. And it sort of brings to asset framing, constantly asset framing the population, because we know that, brown communities, especially poor brown communities, there's so much deficit frame that's applied to our community, to our kids, to the families, right? You don't care. The kids aren't, they're not interested in school. They don't care. They're afraid of acting white, right? They pull each other, they're crabs in a barrel. It's so much deficit frame that then informs their actions to then produce the behaviors. I know the students get frustrated because we don't have high expectations, right? And one of the things that I did as a teacher, during my years in the classroom, I was like, you know what? My classroom is my classroom, and this is our school. Like, we're all welcome here, wherever the level that you are at. I had kids of all different levels, over age. I was a fourth grade teacher. I had like 13-year-olds in fourth grade. I mean, they was old, right? But in my classroom, like, we're here, and whatever troubled soul that they want to give me as the big black man, they'll give us all like the troubled kids. I'm like, hey, come on in. We're going to rock and roll. I never suspended a kid. I never wrote a kid up. Like, I'm going to rock with you. I'm going to work with you. I'm going to come to your house. We're going to talk with mama, grandma, whoever you're living with, right? Because I need you here and I need you learning, right? Yeah. And that was my commitment to liberation. Like, this is not going to be a carceral space outside of my classroom, right? This is my classroom, and we're going to learn together, right? Mm-hmm. So I appreciate you giving those examples from your experience. So before we get to your research, because I always ask this question about what do you hope the impact of your research is, there's a very pertinent topic right now, of course, is on a national scale around this attack on DEI. And so I just want to get your perspective on this, because this comes up because of work that I do, of course, work that you do, that there's like, all right, what do we do now? Like, folks around me are like, oh my, what do we do? We're going backwards. I can't believe, it's all over. And my perspective is a little bit different, but I want to get your perspective on this nationwide attack on DEI.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you said your perspective is different. So I'm wondering like how we'll land together. Yeah. And it's hard to have this conversation publicly because it is more nuanced, and I think that we've been talking about it publicly. And I feel like people can definitely take a soundbite from this and be like, see, this is why DEI is not good. And that's not what I want people to do. I need people to listen to the whole thing. And I'm going to talk about this from what I've seen at the university level. Mm-hmm. On one hand, since I want to say, 2020, right? 2020. Because we get George Floyd, we get COVID, right? So white people feel a little guilty. I want to say that created more opportunities for us to hire Black people, right? At the university level. We've been able to tap into more resources that have been like, we believe in equity and justice, or, all of these things, right? So it has forced people who may be either passive or wasn't taking a stand at all to take a stand, because nobody wanted to be labeled a racist, right? So it forced corporations, it forced universities to kind of take a stand in a more deliberate way, an overt way to say this is a safe space. And part of that, for me, what I got to see, one of the biggest contributions of that was, particularly in the university, was that we were able to hire more Black people. Right? Without having to argue and justify that. or we were able to do more targeting hiring around Black folks and folks of color without having to obscure that, right? So that was definitely a plus in it. So some of the earliest data that we saw that I think that is out here right now is that we know that, one, just like most affirmative action, white women benefited the most from it.
Right.
So now I got questions around it, right? Like, I don't know exactly what all of that means, right? But now I have additional questions of like, what does that mean, right? And how did that happen again, right? Like, how did white women become the benefit factors of DEI? The other issue is, particularly in university and K-12 spaces, this question around, well, what were y'all doing before? because you've claimed that, right? Particularly school spaces have claimed for a very long time that diversity, like in some form or way, we have claimed that we do diversity. We have the multicultural center. We have the EOC, right? Equity, opportunities, all like we have all these that we don't discriminate against race, like right, like we have all these things in place and supposedly legal measures to support that, and yet you need DEI programs. So it became one of those moments of like, so what were we doing before? Lastly, what are we doing now? Right. So I think that was the thing is like, for me, when I was seeing what a DEI program looked like, it wasn't upending what we know to be the settler colonial project of schooling, right? Like it wasn't upending what we have known to be the foundations of schooling, of the genocide of indigenous people and the chattel slavery of Black folks, right? It wasn't upending that, right? And so, we saw more book clubs. We've seen all types of resources to support the performance of equity, but there was never an assurance that came with it of any type of accountability. This consistently becomes my question in my program, right, at my university of like, let's say that students are complaining about a professor being racist and homophobic. What happens? What are we holding that person to? And so it always gets into this place, well, we can't force them to go to things, but we can offer these resources. So I always ask, so then if they don't go, what's the accountability? Right? And understanding accountability not having to be punishment, right? Because we have to move away from the carceral state of things. What is accountability, right? And so I think that's what I've saw is like DEI without accountability attached. And so everyone was able to go around and have book clubs, read these books, feel better about themselves, that they have engaged in some type of work around maybe examining their privilege, but not having to actually be uncomfortable about having to give up any of that privilege.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think we're on the same page in a lot of ways, right? That there was intent, but I think the intent was fueled by guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
And, any movement filled by guilt and shame, that's going to run out. That's going to run out. Once I feel satisfied that I've satiated my guilt and shame, all right, I'm cool. I'm going to go right back to what I did before because I did this action. I called in the speaker. We had this book club. Maybe we diversified our curriculum a little bit. Like, cool. Now we could just go back to normal, right? And even more so, there's been a swing back and an active backlash, as Carol Anderson says. The white rage is, they gonna pay us back for the next couple of decades for having that black president. Right, they're gonna be like, we still here, we still own that country. We celebrated too hard, right?
And we didn't even get anything from it. That's the thing. I'm just like, what did y'all think that we got so much in a country like from the black president that still has to represent this empire, right? Like we did not get much from that, and so I don't even understand this rollback and this punishment in the white rage, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we made them think about race. We made them feel guilty on a national scale, and we're not doing that again. We're gonna put it in the law. You're not even gonna be able to talk about it, right? You can't even use these words. There'll be no more guilt and shame coming out of these institutions, right? And yeah, and DEI, just like I sort of wrote an article. I think it was a couple of years ago, just a trade article around the College Board and African American AP African American Studies, right? That treating these marginal identities as marginal makes it an easy target, right? The College Board has access to a litany of history courses, right, that they offer, but yet they didn't revise their curriculum there. They put it out there as this easy target, right? AP African American Studies.
Yeah.
Now, who's gonna take that class? I don't hear white students knocking down the door and be like, "Oh, we really want that at our school," right? Probably folks of color who are in these high schools who offer this as an offering, right? And so they put it out there as an easy target. There was a backlash to it, and then we can easily aim at it. Same thing with DEI. We kept it in this marginal space instead of incorporating it into how we do business, right? So it's not a target on how we do things, right? It's just how we do things. It's not a target in and of itself. And so we kept it so isolated, and most of it was performance, right? We're just going to perform DEI. We're going to write a statement, right? We're going to have a book club. We're going to invite the speaker. That it never made it into anything of substance, especially when it comes to outcomes for kids of color. And so we didn't start there. We didn't start with like, all right, what are our intended outcomes for kids of color and work backwards. We just gave adults a bunch of things to do and hope for the best. Right. And so this backlash is what we're seeing is like, all right, we got to refine. The work is still there. Just because we can't say these words doesn't mean that these outcomes aren't still there. Right. We just have to figure out how to make it normal and normalize it to address these things through a racialized lens. So the last question I have for you, and I ask this out of every prestigious academic, that, after your litany of research, you go from, assistant to associate to full to endowed, right? You're this, academic of prolific importance 20 years from now. What do you hope your research provides as an imprint? So your research is there. It shouldn't just exist in a journal. That should have some practical implications. So if you said, Dr. Reynolds really influenced me as a practitioner, and I'm doing boom, boom, boom because, like, what do you hope your impact, your research does to the practice in the field of education?
I think it's that, right? I think that whether people are reading my work or not is not as important as I hope that it's inspiring those that come behind me to be radical in their approach in pursuits for education and unapologetic about what that means for Black children. I think the thing that I get most excited about in doing this work is the emails I get from other Black women, mostly because that's usually who they come from. But the emails I get from Black women who are like, I read your dissertation and it's making me think about how I want to approach my own work. And that makes me really proud because I know the hard work that went into doing my dissertation. And I know the tensions of me being like, I can write this for Black girls in the format that is most relatable to Black girls, or I can write this to be a prolific dissertation. And that held me up in my writing. But that wasn't where I was fluent at, right? Like I was fluent in Black girl. That held me up in my writing. I think having a strong dissertation committee of prolific scholars in their own right who were like, Asia, you have to tell the truth because that's who you are. And that's what I want. Like I want people who come behind me to understand, sure, this is a privilege to be in the institution, but now your job is to, I think about Fred Moulton and Stefano Harney when they write about the fugitive higher ed and saying like, my job is now to loot from the university and put back into the community that I'm part of. And so that's what I'm doing. Like, I hope that people come behind me and are like, I want to be like that. And then I'm unapologetic about it, that I'm radical in my approach, and then I'm okay with like standing on that in the name of Black children and Black community.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And that sounds like paving the way, right? Because you are so other people can be. Right? Because every iteration of us, our radical academics in these spaces, creates the space for us people to follow after us, especially with our work. So I appreciate all the work that you do. And I'd like to thank you for coming today. So if people want to follow your work, if they want to find you, like where can they follow Dr. Reynolds? Are you on social media? Do you have are you on a speaker series, your next book? What's going on?
That's a good question. They can find me on, what is it, Academica or Google Scholar.
Okay.
I am not. So I'm on a social media break, but if I do go back, I usually use IG as my private fit. But I don't know. Like, I know we all left Twitter, and I don't know where I'm going yet. I haven't decided where I'm going with everyone else. Do you have suggestions where I should go?
I like LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. That's why I post.
I'm on LinkedIn too. Yeah.
So
that's
what hits up the professionals.
I definitely use my LinkedIn way more now than I used to. So definitely can reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. So this has been another episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Researcher Practice Podcast with Dr. Asia Reynolds. She's an assistant professor of urban education, critical race, and studies in the teacher education department at Wayne State University. Thank you so much for coming today, and I really appreciate you taking time out to talk with all of us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.